بسم الله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. نستكمل بعون الله حديثنا في هذه الأمسية في المحور الخامس والأخير لهذا المنتدى، والذي سوف يختص بواحد من أهم فروع المحاسبة المستحدث حديثا حقيقة، اللي هو البحث والتحري المحاسبي للكشف عن التلاعب والفساد المالي عموما، سواء في القطاعات الخاصة أو في القطاعات العامة. وطبعا لا يخفى على الجميع أنه من الضروري للمملكة أن تكون لديها عمل دؤوب للاستعداد الكامل والوعي بأهمية هذا المجال الحقيقة في ظل النمو المتزايد لرؤوس الأموال والشركات المساهمة التي تمثل الفرد والمجتمع ككل. يوجد معنا الآن في الجلسة ثلاثة من المتحدثين المتميزين الحقيقة في مجال محاسبة التقصي، ولهم خبرة وباع طويل في هذا المجال. نتمنى أن نستفيد منهم جميعا في هذه الأمسية. سوف نبدأ بعون الله بالمتحدث الأول، وطبعا تقدمته هتكون باللغة الإنجليزية لأنه الوصف الموجود عندنا باللغة الإنجليزية. Our first speaker is Mr. Jonathan Campbell James. He is the Director of Fraud Investigations and Dispute Services in Ernst & Young, Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. He is also the former HSBC Head of Security and Fraud Risk for the MENA region. He has also an extensive career in government-related work on fraud, security, and business intelligence services. May you please all welcome with me Mr. Jonathan as he gives his first speech. Mr. Jonathan.
Shukran jazilan, Dr. Rama. Masal khair. And thank you all for coming back after lunch. And it's very good to see the people who have a real interest in the subject coming back to hear us this afternoon. What I'd like to do is to set the scene for the other speakers today by considering, first of all, what is accounting fraud and how can data analytics help in resolving issues which financial professionals come across in the course of their duties. So I'd like to start by giving you some examples of typical accounting frauds. And these types of fraud are prevalent all over the world. So the first one is financial statement fraud, and there were some very, very good examples of this in the Enron scandal. And typically, a financial statement fraud is used to put out into the public domain statements which are not true and which either alter the share price or enable someone to take financial advantage of the error which is being put about. Misstatement of earnings. Dr. Alistair will give you an example of a misstatement of earnings accounting fraud a little bit later. Inflated or deflated inventories. Most of you who are accountants probably started your early days as an accountant counting inventories to ensure that they were as stated in the books. False sales and accounts receivable. In other words, when notice is being taken of projected sales or receivables before they've actually really been received, and inflating the financial picture accordingly. Extending the life of fixed assets. When an asset may have depreciated, a false value for the asset is shown, thereby increasing the overall assets of the company. And then premature revenue recognition and deferral of expenses, again, which alter the financial picture in that particular financial year. Now, that's just an introduction to the types of accounting fraud that are out there in the market, and you as financial professionals will know of many more such examples. And the question I would like to pose this afternoon is, to what extent do we suffer from accounting fraud in Saudi Arabia? Now, we lack the statistics and we lack the public view of some of these accounting frauds, but for sure they will be there. And maybe it's a question which can be discussed when we three speakers have finished talking about whether or not dealing with accounting fraud effectively requires more understanding of what accounting fraud is actually taking place here and now. So that's a question for discussion afterwards. So let's go back now to data analytics. And in very, very simple terms, what we're seeking to do is to identify from a huge quantity of data, from hundreds of millions of transactions, those particular transactions which are of interest from a fraud perspective. And how we move from millions to a short list of suspicious transactions is what data analytics is all about. Now, normally, we use this process when things go wrong in investigating what the problem is. But you can also use data analytics before you encounter a problem to search for particular issues to ensure that those issues are not in the books somewhere. So, data analytics we can use to prevent, detect, and investigate fraud. We also use these techniques to establish the facts and to secure the evidence which will stand up to legal challenge in court. And we can use data analytics in a wider investigative way by identifying and focusing our efforts on particular areas of the investigation which we need to pursue. And normally, in a complicated fraud investigation, you need to have data analytics supporting a fraud investigation effort and vice versa. The two are interrelated and support each other. Now, as I've mentioned before, we can use these techniques proactively before events occur, and we can use them for investigation purposes as well. And we can understand both patterns of individuals' behavior and patterns of corporate behavior as well. And the techniques are applicable to almost every industrial sector. In order for data analytics to work, you need three components. First of all, your data analyst, your forensic data analyst, your fraud investigator, he needs to understand what the fraud risks are and what the compliance regime is within the particular area which you're investigating. Secondly, our data analyst needs to have an understanding of the specific processes and IT systems which are in use in that particular sector. And of course, the easiest example to talk about is in the banking sector, where you need to understand the nature of the banking business in order to identify which are the specific processes which you need to work on. And then your data analyst needs to have special tools and techniques in order to draw from the massive data, that data which you are particularly interested in. How then does a typical engagement work? The first thing you have to do is you have to acquire the data, sometimes called imaging the data. And you need to get that data not just from transactional systems and accounting systems, but also from emails. And then you may need to add to that data collected internally from the target organization or company, you may need also to add external data to help you sort the internal data out and make more sense of it. Now, once you've got your data, you need to repackage it and put it in a form which you can access and which you can display in order to help you with your analytical process. So then when you've got your data organized, you analyze it, and then you end up with that short list of suspicious transactions, or that network of people, or that association of facts, which gives some indication of a pattern of behavior in which the answer to the fraud or to the particular problem lies. And that helps you then to decide and help the investigation move forward. That's either it's jammed or... Yeah, go down to that one there. Thank you, that's perfect.
Page 7.
Yeah.
Enough for this?
I would like to have it. It does.
I think there is a problem with the slide, so you might want to just talk about it while it's...
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Just leave that one up. We'll leave it up there. Okay. We've talked about... we've talked about data analytics and the role they play in conducting investigations in accounting fraud. But I think it's very important to remember that any response to accounting fraud which is confined merely to reacting to events is probably a weak response. Really, if we are to deal with accounting fraud effectively, we need to adopt an enterprise view of the process and realize that preventative measures need to be in place first. We need then to have an ability to detect and react to fraud as it is occurring. And then, of course, we need the reactive process at the end, the investigation process, into which data analytics normally fits. And certainly from the point of view of consulting firms, we always would recommend that any company or organization takes this three-phase prevention, detection, and response approach to fraud matters and to accounting fraud in particular. And that must be the bedrock of the way that we deal with this problem in the long term. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Mr. Jonathan for this wonderful presentation. الآن ننتقل للمتحدث الثاني. Our next speaker is Mr. Altaf Dosa. He is the forensic practice leader at KPMG Gulf Holdings, KSA. He has over 16 years experience in fraud investigation, financial crime compliance reviews, and information security working at KPMG in Luxembourg and in the UK. He is currently working also in assisting Saudi banking regulators, undertaking inspection exercises and reviewing compliance requirements set out by the Capital Market Authority, the CMA. Please join us in welcoming our speaker, and we'll take questions, of course, at the end. You can write your questions in papers. Please, go ahead.
Thank you. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. They say that accounting is a very interesting field to work in. And I know that in the room right now, we've got a number of accountants and we have a number of auditors as well. Now, all this is very good, and I think we have all enjoyed the nice meal offered to us by SOCPA, and thank you very much, and also by the sponsors of this event. But let us now do a bit of stretching exercise. Why? Because we say that to move forward now within the area of forensic accounting, you have to be innovative. Now, I'm not talking about creative accounting, which is the bad thing. You should not be creative with your figures. But delivering your work these days, you have to be innovative and think about new areas, new methods. And Jonathan just mentioned to us the data-driven intelligence, data analytics. Now, for us to be able to assess the level of innovation in this room today, I will ask you a few questions, and you'll work with me with that. If any one of you in the room owns a Motorola phone, please raise your left hand. Any one of you using a Motorola phone? Fine. The next question is, you're going to raise your right hand if you own a Nokia phone. Right hand, anyone? One person here. Now I want you to stand up if you use an iPhone or a Galaxy Samsung phone. Please stand up if you own an iPhone or Samsung Android phone. Right? Gentlemen, right now you can see that you've moved with technology. Please sit down. And you've adapted with the way you're using communication technologies. Before, in the early days, we had the Motorola big phone with a big antenna. Then came Nokia. And then now the Apple came back and Samsung as well. Now, what does that tell us? In terms of business model, Apple and Samsung has been able to capture what the business is looking for and has developed their technologies accordingly. Similarly, in the area of forensic accounting, we move from doing the traditional vouching of journal entries to using technologies, to using imaging of computer data, and so forth. Now, why are we talking about forensic accounting these days in the world of accounting? If you look on the slide up there, if it's too small, I'm going to give you the story. It's all about the Satyam case. Satyam case was investigated in the UK by a joint operation. It was KPMG and our colleagues from Deloitte. We looked into how and why and how much money was being transferred or laundered through this scheme. And here we see that it was also down to the accountant refusing to challenge the different types of operations that they were asked to do. Now, how do you manage, if you're an accountant in a big family business here in Saudi Arabia, let's say you're not related to the family, and the family is asking you to do certain operations. So what do? What are the tools do you have in your hand to say that, nope, this is not right? Is the governance model right? Is the authority matrix in your organization or in your company correct? So we will go through these examples as we go along. Now, the other sets of tools that you have as accountants, as auditors, is to look at the market trend. Now, this particular slide gives you the tools to be able to run your activities, I would say, in a more appropriate manner. What does it say is that if you're an accountant in a finance department and you want to know, okay, what are the typical red flags that you need to look for? Now, what we do within the firm is that we look at all the investigated cases that had reached conviction, we dissect them, we cut them, and then we look at what were the components of the case which we can use as a knowledge base. Now, typically, we say that the fraudster within a company, family business, corporate, would be around the age of 35 to 45 years old. Now, you may ask yourself, why? And why is it always that the man is the one committing the fraud? Now, in the case of the male, and here I will touch on reality, at the age of 35 to 45 years old, us men, well, I hope I'm not talking to everyone, but in terms of the typical man, goes through something what we call the midlife crisis. So we would want a bigger Land Cruiser. Probably we want more holidays in exotic countries. And in some other countries, we want the second wife or the girlfriend. Now, all this requires a lot of money. This is why, at this particular age, you have a tendency to put your hand into the corporate's fund and pull out some more money out of it. The other reason is that also, within the range of 3 to 5 years in an organization, and you as future finance directors or already finance directors would be able to put some controls in place. Typically, the fraudster who spent 3 to 5 years within a company, that person knows the typical weaknesses of that organization. Example here, expense systems. A new joiner in your organization will rarely go in and steal a lot of money. He will need to stay 1, 2, 3 years. He learns how the expense systems work. He learns how the marketing funds get reviewed, if ever. So these persons, they get to learn about those processes, and then they use this to defraud the company. And again, this profile is available on the internet. It's called a profile of the fraudster, and typically this is what helps organizations to try and, in a very quick way, to try and get a feel of, what are the typical red flags. Right. The next thing is it's all good to have forensic accounting. It's all good to have policies and procedures. But have you, when you go back to your companies and organization, have you defined what fraud is all about? What is an act of fraud? Now, if you have to look back to the Saudi environment and ask yourself, where will I get the best definition? You can always use the dictionary. You can always go on the internet. You've got something called the UK Fraud Act. You'll have some definition. But here, locally, you have SAMA, Saudi Arabian Monetary Agency. They have a very good definition of fraud. And only one word I would like you to take out from this slide is the word deceit. Deceit means deception, fooling someone in order to get some benefit. Whatever definition you use on fraud, please make sure that this is highlighted. Because if you deceive someone, you fooled the person to get benefit out, that would constitute or could constitute an act of fraud. Right. So at the very beginning of Jonathan's slide, he also mentioned the different types of fraud, and my colleague Alistair will also be dealing with some of the particulars, some examples of fraud types. But in a nutshell, you could have these types of issues which would lead to a fraud scenarios occurring, right? And I will go through a couple of examples which we've investigated here in Saudi. So I've been in Saudi Arabia now for the last 26 months. So we've got our forensic practice, and we've been able to say, okay, am I going to be able to make or deliver services in Saudi Arabia? Because the word fraud may not be easily acceptable by the community, by the environment in Saudi. I was positively surprised, and you have already in the kingdom the National Anti-Corruption Commission, which is doing a very good work, and also putting out the word, which is in the newspaper, and they've got announcements as well, that brings out the awareness in terms of fraud, bribery, and corruption. Now, practically, what's going to happen if you catch someone in an act of fraud in your organization? What's your exposure? How much money will you need to spend to get an expert in, a consultant like KPMG or the other Big Four to come in to run those investigations for you? What you have to understand these days, we have something called a knee-jerk reaction. Currently, if you lodge a case in the court of law here in Saudi, it will take its time, it will go through the procedures, but then when it comes to the dispute resolution phase, this is where the complication gets in. The sheikh in the court may ask you, whoever gets appointed, please, Company X, go into the organization and investigate the fraud. Find me the quantum. Quantum means the amount of money which has been stolen, which has been diverted. Now, with a statement like this, I can spend 3 weeks to do a work. I can do 6 months digging into the accounts. Now, what's very important in the organization that you work is to have, and here on the slide, a kind of an investigation protocol, a plan to say that, okay, I'm suspecting that if you're a CEO of a company, I'm suspecting that one of my accountants, credit controller, financial controller, moving money from my company A to my company B and then removing it out of the company. So what are the information, what are the sources of data which I need to look for? How do I extract this data so that I can go and present it in a court of law? Now, it's quite interesting. In the court of law in Saudi, it is very, very young in terms of accepting electronic data as evidence. It is growing. The appetite of the sheikh to receive electronic data as evidence in a court of law is growing quite quickly. But again, are your organization ready for it? Do you have a plan? Do you have a procedure for it? And typically, this is what we see and what we've been developing for organization. Now, this last slide here gives you a couple of pointers to the type of issues, challenges that we've been asked to look for. Now, we get appointed by holding companies, group companies wanted to investigate one of their subsidiaries. We get appointed by the grandfather of big Saudi families because their sons are fighting and they want, one of them is claiming that the other person is actually abusing company funds, and we go in and we look for the factual evidence and try and reconstitute the flow of money and the division of profit as well. Or more interestingly, on bullet point number, I would say number 1, 2, 3, 4, payment of excessive facilitation fees through the expense process. Now, we know that the word bribe and corruption in Saudi Arabia is no longer taboo. We are allowed to use these words. Now, what we found for one international company operating in the area of Jeddah, they were trying to get a number of big contracts, and accounting-wise, they could not remove a check of, let's say, 200,000 riyal or buying the next big 4x4 Lexus as a gift. So what were they doing? They were inflating the commissions being given to their sales team, and there was an unwritten agreement with the sales team that part of this commission should be extracted and given to some unauthorized party. So now, technically, accounting-wise, how do you find this irregularity? Unless if you're doing profiling of your commission paid versus the amount of sales that you've done during this particular period, it's not going to be easy. And this is where electronic data review, setting out some protocols and policies and procedures is the way to go. Now, what we're saying is that the bottom line, if you had to take something out of this presentation, is your state of readiness. We have all these methodologies, all these approach there, but are you ready to face such an incident in your organization? And on that particular point, I would like to thank you all, and I'll take questions later on with the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. أشكر السيد ألطف for this beautiful presentation. العرض كان جميل جدا. أحب أذكر الأخوان الأسئلة، إذا أحد عنده أسئلة لو سمحت يكتبها في ورقة وإن شاء الله نعرضها بعد نهاية اللقاء. Our next speaker is Dr. Altsar Hunt. He has extensive experience in financial and economic aspects of litigation related to, particularly to the support of accounting firms and investment banks, especially following the failures of companies like Enron and WorldCom. Dr. Hunt has also taught several executive MBA programs Those include programs in the University of British Columbia, University of Arizona, Boston University, University of Auckland, and Korea University. Let's all welcome Dr. Hunt for his presentation, please.
In the last few minutes of this conference, I'd like to show us the role that accounting plays in litigation. In commercial litigation, there are two parts typically. The first part is establishing or refuting liability, and the second part is quantifying the effect of that alleged liability. So the process goes as follows. Liability is asserted, and the outcome of that court case is that either liability is upheld or it is not upheld. If it is upheld, then the outcome is one of three things. There is liability, but there is no quantifiable harm. There is harm, but it's less than what was quantified by the plaintiff. Or there is harm as it was quantified by the plaintiff. The reality is that these two parts of commercial litigation typically happen at the same hearing, which means that both parties have to have quantified liability regardless of what the finding will be. Accounting plays a role in both parts of the commercial litigation. In establishing or refuting liability, the first part is to identify whether some crime has occurred or not, or perhaps whether the actions of a professional such as a banker, a valuer, professional valuer, a lawyer, etc., has been negligent in their obligations. Another aspect in which accounting plays a role in determining liability is to assess whether the consequences of a particular disaster actually fall within an insured risk category. So this is not quantifying that consequence, but is looking at the nature of that consequence to see whether it is consistent with something that is covered by insurance. And then sometimes accounting plays a role in determining whether there is an effect on third parties. For example, sometimes a professional can be a victim of a particular fraud. So as an auditor or as an investment banker, if we can demonstrate that the auditor or the investment banker was indeed themselves the victim of a fraud, they can indeed suffer a reputational harm as a consequence and bring a suit to be compensated for that harm. Now, in the second part of litigation, which is estimating the consequences of the alleged liability, we can first play a role in assessing the effect on profitability in future years through reduced revenue, increased expenses and the like. The next step is to help the court understand the value consequences of those misstatements of profit. Not only do we have to understand the value consequences of those misstated profits, but we have to place them within a time frame. We have to say when about this misstatement of profitability occurred and over what period did it project incorrect future profitability. And finally, we play a role as accountants in quantifying the extent to which the parties may or may not have been able to mitigate the risk, mitigate the harm. In particular, in securities litigation, we're looking at the misstatement of financial accounts that have led to securities being transacted at a price other than the price that would have occurred if people had been fully informed. And also identifying whether the public or investors may have been able to find the true information through publicly available sources. In other words, it's not sufficient to show that financial statements were misstated. We also have to show that a reasonably sophisticated investor wouldn't have been able to discover the truth through publicly available information. Then we have to work out the prices at which securities would have transacted in the event that true information had been disclosed, and work out what the valuation, work out how people would have been harmed by these valuation consequences. I want to quickly, just a matter of minutes, demonstrate this through the WorldCom fraud. It's a $90 billion fraud, one of the biggest in history, 10 years old now at least. But it's useful because many of us are familiar with it, and also it's old enough where we don't have to worry particularly about confidentiality issues. We can see that the company had essentially defaulted and was delisted halfway through 2002, but it wasn't until 2004 that we had restated financial information for 2003 and 2004 fiscal years. And when it did come, we didn't have quarterly information and we didn't have proper restated accounts. We were retained to assist investment banks that were being sued as a result of the registration documents filed in the issuance of bonds in 2000 and 2001. The securities litigation was brought against the bond underwriters on the basis of the allegedly false SEC registration statements. And two questions arise. What would the bond prices have been in the absence of the misstated accounting information? And would the bonds have been issued at all if people had known the truth about WorldCom? When we look at the restated information that came out in March 2004, it was not sufficient to be able to assess the value consequences through time with respect to trading in the bonds. And there were three reasons for this. First, the information was annual rather than quarterly. It was categorised by the type of accounting impropriety rather than particular line items that had been misstated. And the third thing was that some of the restatement was actually bundled up in the opening retained earnings in the restated financial statements. Forensic accounting played a role in overcoming these three difficulties. You can see standardised prices for WorldCom bonds from 2001 through to the middle of 2002. And you can see that the red line represents the prices at which the bonds did transact in reality. The blue line is our estimate of what the bonds would have traded for if people had known the truth. The restatement information was presented in the financial statements in 2004 as follows, showing the categories of the accounting irregularities and their consequences in each of the years 2000, 2001. Then there was some information that came out in a quarterly filing in 2002, and we have the opening retained earnings difference, which tells us what happened in 1999 or before. As you can see, that tells us that 3/4 of the fraud had occurred by the end of 2000, and almost all of it had happened by the end of 2001. But it doesn't tell us how much of this fraudulent accounting behaviour had occurred by the time of the issuance of these two bonds. What we need to do is take the $77 billion total restatement amount from the previous slide, the $77 billion you see in the bottom right-hand corner there. And we need to partition that through time and by value relevance. We need, first of all, to take it and spread it through time so we understand where in time accounting profitability and financial position had been adjusted. We also need to spread it across categories of value relevance. It's probable that an investor in these bonds might think differently about the value of the total company and therefore the value of the bonds if they were looking at $1 extra of revenue that had been fraudulently presented. They may think about the value consequences differently if it was some sort of adjustment to a restructuring reserve where it was pretty obvious what was going on. What was happening in the early stage of the litigation was allocation across quarters based on some very rough information that came out of the report of investigation prepared on behalf of the board of WorldCom. The problem with that is that the report of investigation totals didn't equal the same as the restated financial information, and it really was pretty rough. The solution was to actually go through all of the details of the restatement analysis. This is one little piece of Deloitte work product that was prepared based on KPMG work product. There were 15 tranches of restatement adjustments, and the process that was undergone here was a detailed Rubik's Cube of trying to understand what of those adjustments related to which time period. Next was to try and understand the value relevance. And the first step there was to look at whether these were operating or non-operating adjustments to operating or non-operating profit. But the problem was that there were some of these restatement categories that really had parts that were very value relevant and parts that were not. The real trick was to try and understand how we could break this down not only by financial statement line item, but also by restatement category. We had the restatement category from what was disclosed in 2004, and we could compare the 2004 financial statements with the previously disclosed financial statements and look at the change per line. But it was an extremely difficult and interesting Rubik's Cube puzzle, an accounting puzzle, to try and understand how we filled in this grid. For example, if we saw a line item had changed by $7 billion to do with, say, the tax expense, we also wanted to see how that tax expense $7 billion change related to each one of the restatement categories. As you can see, it was extremely important that someone had deep accounting knowledge and could actually unravel this for the court. In conclusion, I'd just like to say that forensic accounting plays a huge role in commercial litigation, both in terms of identifying liability and also quantifying the harm associated with that liability. In securities litigation, the quantification of the harm requires estimation of the prices at which securities would have traded but for the alleged misleading financial information. When restatement information exists, it's generally not sufficient for this purpose. And so we have to go through a process of spreading it through time and categorizing its value consequences. And securities litigation, as my colleagues before me have indicated, is just one particular way in which accountants play a role in dispute resolution.
Thank you very much. نشكر المتحدث الأخير ونفتح المجال. الحقيقة الآن باقي لنا حوالي 5 دقائق إذا نلتزم بالوقت النهائي للجلسة. نشوف إذا في أسئلة. السؤال الأول موجه للسيد ألطف دوسة for you. أنا بقول السؤال بعربي بعدين بترجمه. السؤال موجه للسيد ألطف دوسة: في أي مرحلة تعتقد أن ثقافة التعامل مع الاختلاس والرشاوي في بيئة الأعمال في منطقة الخليج؟ وهل يوجد استفتاءات أو استقصاءات أو دراسات في هذا الموضوع؟ Are there any studies about the level of corruption or the level of fraud in the Gulf region that you are aware of?
Right. I mean, we've got one of the main one will be the report from Transparency International, which gives the ranking. I don't believe that they've updated it since last year, but that would give a ranking of all the countries within the MESA region and on the level of transparency. The other one is from our colleagues. They've also done some reviews on the number of cases being reported in the region. Now, what we're currently doing is, and again, that would all depend on the level of participation of the organization here in Saudi Arabia, is to benchmark anonymously the number of cases which organizations have encountered throughout the year.
Thank you. Yes, please, go ahead.
I think there is quite detailed information on the levels of fraud in particular sectors. For example, in the banking area, particularly in accordance with the Basel rules, the levels of fraud are fairly accurate. And to give you an example, there are very detailed statistics of the levels of card fraud in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, in comparison with other regions of the globe. And I think we can draw a conclusion from that, that the Middle East and the Kingdom are not isolated from trends which are occurring elsewhere. Levels of fraud may not be quite the same as in other areas, but we suffer from the same types of fraud, and consequently we must prepare to deal with those types of fraud accordingly, taking advantage of the knowledge that we have of trends and practices elsewhere.
Thank you very much. One more question. بس سؤال أخير.
أنا بدي أقول رأيي إن أنا في اعتقادي إنه عمليات البحث والتقصي غالباً ما تفلح بشكل كبير في اكتشاف حالات الفساد، يعني صغار الفاسدين. كبار الفاسدين دائماً محميين أو عندهم حصانة، غالباً اكتشافهم يكون صعب من عمليات البحث والتقصي. يمكن تحتاج كوارث عشان تكتشف حالات الفساد اللي ممكن تحصل فيها.
هذا في الواقع حقيقة في أغلب دول العالم، يعني دائما نشوف إنه تصير مشاكل كبيرة وفرود على مستوى كبير، أحيانا تروح فيها يعني دول على مستوى الدول تصير المشكلة كبيرة. لكن I want to give this question to the panel. You already have the translation, so I assume you want to interject.
I think when the fraud is large, and when the sums of money are really, really big, it's very unlikely that fraud is contained within one single jurisdiction. So I can think of some very big frauds which have occurred over the past 3 years, which have involved Saudi players, where the legal process has taken place elsewhere. So I think actually it's quite difficult to keep the lid on the box of a big fraud when there are global links to almost every large-scale fraud of that particular character.
Yes. Have any follow-up?
Yeah, I mean,
Excuse
what?
me.
Sorry, go ahead.
That's me. That's me here.
I can't see you.
I'm here.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, I have one last question, please.
We just we have to wrap up.
Okay, no problem.
I'm sorry.
I apologize. Sorry about that.
Please.
Yeah, I mean, what you're correct by saying that sometimes it's a bit hard to determine all these big payments or to stop it from happening. But the thing is that recently, what we've seen here in the Kingdom, there has been a move towards making the awareness a bit wider. So yes, it's not going to happen overnight, but it will happen in terms of creating the awareness and putting the right controls in place to detect it.
Great. أشكر الجميع الحضور. ما أدري إذا ما أعتقد في عندنا وقت زيادة أو كافي لأي أسئلة زيادة، لكن الموضوع شيق ومهام جدا، وأعتقد إنه نكون سذج لو نعتقد إنه الفساد المالي لا يمكن أن يطال المكان زي المملكة أو كذا، لأنه هذه الأمور دائما لها بيئة معينة وممكن تحصل في أي مجتمع أو اقتصاد. أحب أختم بشكر الدكتور أحمد المغامس رئيس الهيئة وشركة الكهرباء على التنظيم المميز، وأشكركم جميعا على الحضور وحسن الاستماع. Great job.